When people talk about wet flies, they may sometimes be referring to any fly fished below the surface. I am going to put streamers, nymphs, and soft hackles and terrestrials in their own category. So when I talk about wet flies, I am referring to a fly resembling a flying insect with its wings folded back. The first thing I'll say about wet flies is that they are not necessary to catch fish. There's no situation when you couldn't substitute a wet fly with some other type of fly and probably catch just as many fish. So you might ask, why fish wet flies if they aren't necessary? Well, there are several reasons. For one, many people, including myself, find it fun to try different flies and catch fish on them. Secondly, wet flies are thin and compact. You can fit a whole bunch of them in your fly box without taking up much room. Once you start accumulating a lot of flies, this is a feature you will appreciate. Third, when fishing, I often find myself in some really scenic environments catching some highly colorful fish. And I feel a certain obligation to match the scenery. Wet flies are often colorful themselves, and there's a certain aesthetic in fishing them. There are a lot of wet fly patterns out there. I'm going to recommend you keep things simple and just get your wet flies in a size 14. If they're any smaller than that, the fish may have trouble seeing them. If they're any larger, the fish may see them too well and recognize they are fake. A size 14 mimics most drowned insects fairly well. I have noticed a tendency for dark colored wings to work better than white. So stick to dark colored wings, although there are exceptions when bright colorful patterns may work better. I would start off recommending the black gnat wet fly. It's kind of a dull looking fly, but there have been days when it has produced fantastic results for me on brook trout. After that, my second favorite fly would be the butcher wet fly. With dark wings, a shiny body, and a touch of red in the tail, I've had good luck catching brown trout, rainbows, and cutthroat on this fly. One of my favorite wet flies is actually a dry fly, the Henryville caddis, also known as a Henryville special. With the exception of the hornberg and midge, most other dry flies do not fish well below the surface, but the Henryville caddis is one of my favorite brook trout wet flies when tied behind a small spinner or spoon. Other flies of honorable mention would be the Alexander wet fly, the black and orange wet fly, and the guinea hen wet fly. There are over 24 different wet fly patterns that are popular and used by a lot of people, but when it comes to wet flies, you really only need a few patterns. Wet flies are very versatile in how they may be fished, and are at their best when targeting pan-sized trout up to about 12 inches. Above 12 inches, some trout will show a preference for streamers, soft hackles, or nymphs, but larger fish can still be caught. Here's an example of myself catching a 14-inch cutbow hybrid on a wet fly. I would not use a wet fly if I'm targeting strictly larger sized trout. These flies tend to work all season long, even during the early spring before most of the hatches or terrestrials have appeared. Small to medium-sized streams are the best places to fish wet flies. I've had good success using them on both freestone streams as well as spring creeks. Keep in mind these flies are small and therefore need to be fished a little slowly. A number 14 wet fly tied 18 inches behind a 1/16 ounce spinner is a very effective method almost anywhere. If you want to use a larger spinner, say 1/8 ounce, I would advise to tie a streamer 18 inches behind the spinner and then tie the number 14 wet fly 18 inches behind the streamer. Otherwise, that little wet fly is going to get overwhelmed by the much larger and louder spinner. A 1/16 to 1/10 ounce spoon, preferably a slow sinking spoon, is a very good method to fish wet flies. Try to give some extra action by moving your rod tip back and forth. Cast up and across, slowly swinging the fly downstream at a speed just slightly faster than the current. Drifting in the current below a floating crankbait works quite good. I sometimes like to tie on a wet fly 12 inches below a beadhead nymph to ensure it sinks deep enough. When fishing a slow-moving stream, it really pays to give your crankbait an occasional twitch. This often triggers a strike. Fishing a wet fly below a floating crankbait in a lake or pond is not advisable. In those instances, I would use a nymph, an ant, or a scud, or fish your wet fly behind a spinner or spoon.